Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Philip Osteen. I'm the interim dean here at the University of Utah College of Social Work. And again, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. This is our first presentation in the 2022-2023 Grand Challenges for Social Work series titled Seeking Wisdom, an Indigenous Journey. As many of you may know, the Grand Challenges for Social Work are a call to action for our practitioners and researchers to harness social work science and knowledge base, collaborate with individuals, community-based organizations, and professionals from all fields and disciplines in order to work together to tackle the prevalent social harms in the United States. We are joined in this effort by others who value this call to action. Special thanks to this event go to alum Ruth Gallagher and retired Voices of Diversity coordinator Irene Oda. Before we start with today's presentation, on behalf of the College of Social Work, it is particularly fitting that I recognize the contributions of our American Indian community members by acknowledging that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is a traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationships between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm that the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Thank you to those of us who are joining us in person, as well as those who are viewing today's presentation online. If you're here in person and you have registered to earn CEU hours, please be sure to sign in and out of our check-in table. And if you're viewing this presentation online and would like CEU hours, we'll have a link to a brief quiz that will be emailed to you in a couple of days. Today, we are honored to welcome Michael Bird, a distinguished University of Utah MSW alum. This presentation will focus on Mr. Bird's work in creating and shaping pathways towards better health and well-being for Indigenous communities. Our 90-minute event will proceed as follows. First, we will hear from Michael Bird. Following his presentation, Dr. Dina Nad, one of our faculty here in the College of Social Work, will lead a panel discussion. The audience is welcome to share questions during that panel discussion. And for those attending the presentation online, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit any questions that you might have. It truly is my great pleasure now to introduce our presenter. Michael Bird is a Kiowa Pueblo Indian from New Mexico. He has more than 30 years of public health experience in with Native American populations. He was the first American Indian and social worker to serve as president of the American Public Health Association, a grand distinction, as well as the first Native member of the National Policy Council at AARP. He's also served in various capacities with the United States, including the Indian Health Service for 20 years, and was executive director of the National Native American AIDS Prevention Center. Since 2007, Mr. Bird has served as a member of the Health Advisory Committee for the National Collaborating Center for Aboriginal Health in Canada. He earned his MSW here from the University of Utah, where he was recognized as a distinguished alum in 2022. He also earned a Master in Public Health from the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health, which in 2018 named him one of its 75 most influential alumni in the school's 75-year history. We hope this presentation, along with the associated CEU opportunity, will serve you well. Mr. Bird, on to you.
Thank you. I haven't done anything yet. The level of expectation just went up by about 100. Now I'm scared. Maybe I'll just take the podium up there, and you'll be, okay, we're all good. Yeah, we're all good. Let me just say, first of all, thanks for showing up. Thanks for showing up. I'm Michael Bird, and I just would, first I want to say just thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today, and the invitation with the public health program with Steve and social work, because in my experience and in both professionally and personally, there is a real intersection and a connection, in my mind, between social work and public health. And I know this not only from my training, but from my lived experience in doing medical social work to begin with, in terms of my career with the Santa Fe Indian Hospital. And that's my home community, but I had not done social work in my own community. And it was a real introduction to my community, the nature of the problems, the extent of the problems, and the issues that our communities faced and continue to face to this day. It also, I'll be honest with you, after 4 years in the Indian Health Service doing medical social work, I was burned out. I was idealistic, naive, and it was like jumping into the ocean, and I thought I was going to drown. The waves kept coming, and they never stopped. And I said, I gotta do something. I gotta move on. So that was part of the inspiration to move on. But the other part of it was recognizing that the position I was in, it was like a revolving door, and there was always another crisis, another challenge, another situation. And with a small hospital, I saw anything and everything that comes through the door. And so I knew that in that position, it really was never going to change. And so for my own sanity and for my wanting to have more impact, I looked around, and public health looked appealing, and particularly from the standpoint of prevention and addressing issues before they became crises, and reducing the number of people that were coming in, working in community, putting into place programs and structures that would reduce the number of people that were coming in, or the critical nature of their presenting at the hospital. So that's kind of, in a quick synopsis, how I kind of social work and public health. In my mind, they're operating the same very much similar value base, and the orientation is very similar. It's about people wanting to work with communities and to improve the conditions that people face, and God knows Indian communities. If you look at the data, and if you're familiar with any of the data, know that American Indian communities have the highest, some of the, in terms of social indicators, mortality, morbidity rates, ours is the highest of any population, and has been since about day one. But I'm going to kind of, there's something I have to say that and share with you that, and I want to see how many people are familiar with this, because this is the issues that Native populations face are not unique. I mean, there's a whole world of Indigenous people, millions, and I'm just going to ask you if you could raise your hand. How many of you have seen the HBO documentary "Exterminate All the Brutes"? If you would just raise your hand. Okay, a handful of you. Well, I'm going to put a plug in for something that I think is really critical in any conversation about racism. And the film was produced by Raul Peck, who's Haitian, grew up in Haiti, but then was born in Haiti and grew up in New York City. And I'm just going to read a little synopsis of it to pique your curiosity. Exterminate All the Brutes is based on 3 texts that critically understand the history of European expansion from the perspective of those most impacted by it: Africans, African Americans, Indigenous people of the Americas, and the people of Haiti, and Jewish survivors of the German Holocaust. It is a history of 5 centuries without the unusual whitewashing of conventional history telling by calling out colonialism as the genocidal product that it was. The most compelling aspect of Peck's telling of post-Columbus history is the way it links genocide, both indigenous and Jewish, with African slavery based on white supremacy and the artificial constructions of race. And here at the U and across the nation, there are a lot of conversations going on about racism. American Public Health Association has defined racism as a national public health issue. So one of the things I would suggest is the opportunity. I hope the opportunity is presented to you all to view. It's a 4-part documentary. There's got to be a way of accessing it. It's on HBO. I don't subscribe to HBO, but I have people that are smarter than me and know how to access the system. So you can get, like, I think, a 30-day opportunity to view it and then cancel the subscription. It is not. I've studied a lot of history and a lot about genocide, both in this country as well as globally. And it is the best documentary I have ever seen in my entire life. So, and it is not make some popcorn and sit down and have a good time. It is very challenging. It is very brutal, and it is very honest. But it's the kind of information and history that we all need to know. Because the challenges we're facing in this nation and as well as racism across the globe, we have to understand how it started, where it started, and none of us are responsible for what happened in the past. You know, you're not responsible for what happened to Indians or African Americans or any community that's been oppressed. We weren't there. So, but what we are accountable for is what's happening now. And it begs the question, what can we and what should we do to address the issue that we all are confronted in? Because nobody's I don't see people bailing on this country just yet. Well, maybe there's some. They can afford to, I guess I can't. But we really have to, in order to address the issue, we have to understand, you know, it's like weeds in a yard. You can just pull them out or cut them down, but you have to get to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem, really, you have to understand how it all started. And Raul Peck's film does the best job of explaining in a very comprehensive, honest fashion. So let me just leave it at that for now. I wanted to also just, why don't we go ahead and, first slide, please. I'm sorry. Okay, got it. Okay. There is a number of conversations about our nation's original sins. And you can read this, and I think, though, that if you just look at the statue of Teddy Roosevelt that was in New York at one of the major museums, that image, in fact, really conveys a historical message. And as we see, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, one of our presidents, has an interesting history. He's astride a horse, and of course, to our left is an Indian walking, and to the right is an African American portraying a slave, I'm sure. And this really, in my mind, in so many ways, captures the history of this nation. It conveys a time and a period of colonial subjugation of Native people and the enslavement of African American people. And it has been documented that in terms of, this really was foundational to this nation's history. Unfortunately, much of this is not taught. You know, we hear the story about the Pilgrims and the Indians sitting down, everybody happy, everybody eating, everybody sharing. Well, that's a story. It's a narrative, but it's a false narrative. And they're false narratives that have been created over the history of this country as it relates to Native populations and as it relates to African Americans and the slavery that they experienced and endured. And the foundation to this nation was genocide and slavery. Let me just say, if you haven't read this, if you haven't seen, it's documented. It is real. It happened. And it explains in many ways many of the social conditions that our communities experience to this day. This quote actually is one of the best quotes I have found that really sort of lays the foundation for understanding what happened in this country. Of course, we all know Columbus discovered America in 1492. He was headed for India. He didn't actually touch the continental United States. He was in the Caribbean. And there's an Indian joke, bad Indian joke, about it's a good thing he was looking for India, not Turkey. Otherwise, we'd be called turkeys. Anyway, we got to laugh about some of this because it's really not, it's challenging information. As I said, 80 to 100 million Native people died as a result of contact. It is estimated, and that's in North and South America combined. In what we now consider the Americas, North America, the number was, there were 10 million Native, they estimate 10 million Native people in North America, and it was reduced in a century to less than 1 million. And there was conversation about, it was, the vanishing Indian, because they thought, we were done. But we had other ideas, so much for that. And I think that in terms of African American slavery, there were two pillars to this nation. One was the genocide of Native people for land. It's always been about the land. It continues to be about the land. And for African Americans, it was enslavement and labor. There was a value. So while African Americans were valued enslaved because of their labor that they produced, I'd say on the other hand, Indians had no value. There was no economic value in Indians. They occupied the land that was desired, and so in a fashion it was like coyotes and wolves and grizzlies and every other kind of creature out there that there was no value, and so extermination was the rule. And although the narrative Manifest Destiny created this wonderful story and illustration about pioneers, marching across the prairies and God's on our side, and this is what the Lord has given to us. Well, part of that mythology and that myth really goes back to when Columbus contacted the Americas. The Vatican in 1493, of course, established the doctrine of discovery, which was they call it a papal bull. And it basically contended that Native people, if you weren't Christian and you were Native, you didn't have souls. Therefore, you really were not human. And anything you could subject those populations to anything you wanted to. And it was really a premise in so many ways for an excuse for taking the land. And that has become part of the legal body of knowledge that still guides legal thought in terms of Indian law and its implications for this country to this day. and that concept of manifest destiny, was universal. We know about, various periods of time. The Wounded Knee massacre in South Dakota, Trail of Tears and in New Mexico and New Mexico, there was another incident called the Long Walk, in which Dene people and Apache people were captured and forced to march across from the western part of New Mexico to the eastern part of New Mexico, and it was basically, again, terrible, horrible conditions, and many of the people died on the march, and many of them died in the area that they were placed because there wasn't really good water, there wasn't really provisions to feed them. Eventually, I believe it was Abraham Lincoln sort of said, this is not working, and so they were allowed to return back to their respective reservations. The concept of the only good Indian is a dead Indian was coined. The whole notion of kill the Indian, save the man was part of the mentality that was exhibited. Now I'm just going to go into this is going to be quick and dirty because this is a course that could be a course, and this is an overview of federal policy from basically 1492 earlier on, and talks about the various time frames and where European powers, the French, the Spanish, the British all wanted to have good relations with tribal nations because tribal nations were large and potent, had military capability, and so everybody was vying for establishing positive relationship with native tribes. That soon passed, and then we moved on to what is considered the removal period, in which land was then tribes were forced out of their in genocidal activities. They were forced out of their homelands, forced west, and then it moved on to a period called reservation systems, where we wanted Indians out of the prime real estate and the prime areas and moved them into areas and tried to physically locate them out of any sort of, so there was reduce the amount of contact and conflict. From 1870s to 1930s, there was an assimilation period, which was, again, boarding schools. And of course, I think maybe you've heard about the report that Deb Haaland just initiated and was released, I think, just a couple of weeks ago about about American Indians in boarding schools across this country, which was part of the assimilation process to take Indian children away from their families, to try and not allow them to speak their language, practice their customs or their religion. And in fact, many churches, the Catholic Church among others, were involved in this activity. And that report has been issued. And I think that if you're concerned about child welfare and what happened as a building block in terms of, one of the building blocks in the policy for assimilation and cultural annihilation, in a sense, was the assimilation period. In the 1930s, there began to be a recognition and a better understanding of what tribes were pushing back on and trying to establish their sovereignty. And one of the key elements that I failed to mention right at the beginning was that American Indians are an ethnic community, as this nation is made up of many ethnic communities. But one significant differentiation is that American Indian tribes, because we were here before anyone, have a government-to-government relationship with this nation. We are the only population, the only community that have treaties and have a political standing because of treaties and because of executive orders. And that is unique and no other entity, no other community has that kind of a relationship. And it is really, it's the whole basis for Indian law. And it's the whole basis for our special and unique status, not just as a community of color, but as a political entity, as tribal nations, because we entered into treaties. The United States government entered into treaties with Native tribes, and so it is a different type of relationship, and it is one that tribal nations and Indian people hold on to dearly, because it is the one thing. You know, in spite of the fact that how many hundreds of treaties were made and they were never, all of them were broken, we still recognize, we still are holding this country responsible to the commitments it made to Native people. As I mentioned, the 30s and the 50s, it was more Indian self-rule, more of a recognition of the need to work with tribal governments and recognize tribal sovereignty and establish better relationships. In the 1950s, it began. There's been this pendulum in federal policy. In the 1950s, it went again back to termination and assimilation, and there were a host of Native tribes, most notably the Menominee in Wisconsin, where they lost. The federal government just said, "You're not Indians. We have no obligation. We have no responsibility to you." Although they had a relationship with the Menominees. There were other tribes that were terminated as well, but the Menominees, interesting enough, in years since then, reestablished that federal government-to-government relationship. We move into the 1960s and the era of self-determination, and this was under the Richard Nixon administration, in which there was a true acknowledgement that the United States government needed to work with tribes and recognize tribal sovereignty and establish working relationships with tribes, because all of these other sort of policies had not been effective and had not really improved the conditions of Native people. Out of the self-determination period was Public Law 93-638, Indian Self-Determination. That program allowed for tribes to contract or take over their own education systems and their health systems. And up until then, all of the obligation and the duty to fulfill those responsibilities to Native people was handled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in terms of education, social services, social workers, education programs. And the health programs were handled by the Indian Health Service, U.S. Public Health Service, Indian Health Service. But during the self-determination period, you began to see tribes contracting for, the law was passed, and they were able to take over and run and manage their own programs. And many tribes did that. It's continued to this day with a lot of programs that tribes have taken over in terms of Indian Health Service. My own tribe, I assisted my own tribe back in New Mexico to take over our health center from the Indian Health Service. It was a battle because they were acting like it was their money, it was our money. They were doing very little for our community, and we took it over with a good lawyer. That's the one thing you have to do when you're dealing with bureaucratic systems like the Indian Health Service, who's supposed to be supporting and encouraging and helping. In some cases, they act like you're taking it out of their wallet, and it's not their money to begin with. That wallet may be theirs, but now money's not. And so we took over our health center from the Indian Health Service, established, fully funded the program. The program has gone through like 3 expansions. We're providing an array of programs, prevention programs, oral health programs, dental programs, vision programs, and programs that were not available on the reservation in the community. That's just one example. There are many tribes. Rayma Navajo in New Mexico was one of the earliest tribes to take over their education system and their healthcare system, and they've done an incredible job improving the conditions of their own people, hiring their own people, and developing their own capacity, which is critical to, and which was part of the intent of Indian self-determination. 1988 to the present, we began to look at, again, self-determination manifesting itself and rolling out in self-governance. And the majority, with the Indian Health Service, the majority of the Indian Health Service budget at this point now is being managed and by tribes. And you see more and more of that, and you see improved outcomes. You see more in the way of services, and it's really the way it should be. Indians running their own programs for their own people, and it produces better outcomes. And again, this, let you read that. The United States government made treaties, made commitments to Native people, and we've not forgotten. We will never forget. And while we can make treaties with other nations and other globally, and talk about fulfilling our commitment to other in treaties to national entities, to I don't know if we got a treaty with Ukraine, but we have treaties with the British and the French and all kinds of foreign entities, but we're still holding them accountable to this commitment. Moving right along, there has always been resistance on the part of Native people, although militarily and conquest and everything that played out in terms of the price that Native people have paid in terms of their lives, defending their land and their resources. This is just sort of a shopping list of some of the issues that we have seen and that exhibits the effort to ensure that our livelihood, that our nations grow, that our nations survive. And there have been legal challenges, local, state, and federal courts, from day one. There are two cases that have been decided. One by the Supreme Court just last year was the McGirt case in Oklahoma, in which a number of tribes asserted their sovereignty over their land and jurisdiction, and they engaged in a legal battle with the state, and actually the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the tribes having jurisdiction over their own land, which of course, in terms of the state of Oklahoma and the powers that be, the governor and the legislature, was very upsetting to them because they wanted to control the agenda. There's also, for social workers and those of you who are concerned with Indian child welfare, there's going to be a case that's going to be presented to the Supreme Court, again, about the Indian Child Welfare Act, because there are challenges to the Indian Child Welfare Act. The Indian Child Welfare Act basically arose when Indian children, again, under an assimilation policy, were being taken from their parents and their homes and their reservation and placed with non-natives. And at the basis of this, in many cases, was really a racist is racist to take children out of their home, and it's part of the assimilation policy. It's part of a real lack of respect for Indian communities, Indian families, and it really has disrupted, as the report, the boarding school report that just came out from the Department of Interior under Deb Haaland's leadership is pointing out that has been an extremely disruptive, destructive program in terms of Native populations. And many families have been impacted by that. And to this day, it's one of those things that you break a family up, you disrupt, you remove culture, you remove traditional teachings, you remove language. If you subjected any population, any community to that, you're going to have long-going challenges and difficulties. There actually is, here's something really interesting. There actually are some studies now, and have been more studies, about epigenetics, and that trauma that occurs generations before does, in fact, it's transmitted genetically. And if you have a disruptive environment, if you don't have the things that children and families and communities need to support positive outcomes, it continues to replicate and play out and manifest itself in a number of different ways. So that's a growing and area of research, and I think there's something to be said for that. I think some of the research has actually looked at Jewish survivors of the Holocaust as well, and I think that this has kind of spun off from that as well. Going back to Alcatraz and the takeover in San Francisco back in the 60s during, when everything was not peace and love and flowers, there was Vietnam War going on, and a number of Indian people said, well, you got an empty prison there, that's like reservation life, let's take it over. yeah. What's the difference? No running water, no lights. That's like home, Anyway, they took it over and held it for quite some time, and of course they eventually were evicted. But I think they made the point, and the point is for Native people, and it's just so. It's so self-evident to many of us who are Native, and there was a Kellogg report just a couple of years ago that pointed out 40% of the people in this nation today don't even know that they're still Indians. I believe it. I think the other 60 probably wish we weren't still here, but anyway, that's just my opinion. But 40% of the population in this country don't even realize that they're still Indians. I believe that. In my own professional life, in nationally, and with APHA, and in public health, at a variety of settings, people don't see us. They don't realize we're still here. And part of it has to do with because our numbers are small. We're not out there in the same numbers that other communities, larger communities of color, are operating in where people go to school together, they work together, they socialize with each other. So there's the opportunity for exchange and hopefully positive, constructive dialogue. But with Native people, because I've had so many experiences where there'll be a diversity meeting and I could tell you, I can name, that's another conversation. But there'll be a diversity meeting, an equity meeting, and it's at this university or it's this organization, and I'll look at the invitees, or I'll look at the participants. It's like you're going to be talking about racism, and there's no Indians in the room. there's that's how, in terms of North America, that's how it started. And if we're not part of the conversation, how can we? First of all, you're off base. We have to be in the room. We have to be in the room. If you're going to have a conversation about racism and there's no Indians in the room, something's wrong. And there are major universities and there are major for-profit, non-profit organizations that are out there, environmental groups. There's no representation from Native people. And they've got all these ideas about how they're going to fix the environment and, global warming. And, well, if anybody knows anything about clean air, clean land and water, and the importance of land and the relationship with land, that it's not just I know people know this, but we don't see ourselves separated from the earth. I mean, it's what provides sustenance. It provides life to us, and we know this. It's referred to as our Mother Earth because it is our mother, and she's produced everything we need to be healthy and to live good lives. And unfortunately, with an exploitive model of people, an exploitive model of nature, we're not cherishing and recognizing and respecting that, and it in fact is leading us to where we are today in terms of global warming and our negative impact on the environment. And if you want to live, and people want to go to Mars, well, we might be in the. I don't want to be negative, but we might be in the process of creating our own Mars right here on Earth. Standing Rock. 2016, and Native nations coming together, and it was the largest gathering of Native people providing resistance to the Army Corps of Engineers, and DAPL protecting their land and their water, and defining themselves as water protectors, not protesters, but protectors, not only of their land, but any water downstream. In case people forget, water flows downstream, and it's off reservation. And this was the largest gathering of Native and non-Native people demonstrating resistance to something that is and has been impacting Native reservations. I don't have to tell you about New Mexico, and back in the 50s, then 60s and 70s, and to this day, there are parts of number of reservations where people were engaged in uranium mining, and it was defined as national sacrifice areas. And those tailings are still have not remedied, the EPA and the federal government still has not remedied a number of those conditions down there, and people are still being subject to radiation in a variety of ways. As I mentioned, the Federal Indian Boarding School, Deb Holland, I'm happy to say, is Laguna Pueblo Indian from New Mexico. She's a great advocate. But again, you look at representation, and she's the first, what year is it? She's the first Native person to have ever served in a cabinet level position in this nation. The first. No wonder this country's a mess. There haven't been enough women, number one, and certainly no Native women engaged in that kind of representation. And she's doing an excellent job in terms of the boarding school, in terms of something that has proponents and opposition in terms of Bears Ears. And needless to say, New Mexico, some people like to think New Mexico is enlightened, and we are in some ways. It's culturally diverse, but she's only the first Native person to ever serve in Congress in the whole history of New Mexico. If we're so progressive and we're so enlightened and we're so diverse, where's the rest of the representation from Native people? She's the first. And thank God she is, because there is a groundswell. There are more Native people engaged in activities, advocating for their communities. There's a Native woman, Alaska Native woman, who's now in Congress and running for office in the House of Representatives. She would be the first Native woman from Alaska. There's Sharice Davis from Oklahoma. No, not Oklahoma, it's Kansas. Who's serving in the Congress, and she served along with Deb Holland. So thank God for Indian women. Yeah, thank God for Indian women. The other element in this is missing and murdered Indigenous women. There was little to no attention, and again, it's been advocacy from the Native community. It's been Deb Holland pushing this as an issue. In New Mexico, they just had the governor declared last Saturday, there was a big gathering of all the tribes and people allies and families coming together at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque to really pull together in a systematic fashion all the police and law enforcement to really sit down and begin to really address this issue in a meaningful way. Because Native women and others as well, particularly Native women though, have been missing and murdered for years, and no one has really paid any attention to that issue. If it had been another community, I dare say there would have been more interest and more activity in that regard. So I just want to say it's not, we're still resisting to this day. And we require everyone's support and everyone's commitment to ensuring that we have the opportunity to have a voice, to be able to have support because again, our numbers are small. It's one of the metaphor for me in terms of national organizations and representation is it's like having a basketball team with 5 members. Because our population is small, because the opportunities have not been there until recent times, we put out a team, 5 members. Other communities, larger population base, longer history of opportunity for education, and have established, networks. Other populations have 20 players. They're all lined up. They can sub somebody in there easily. And for our community, we've got, I'm the only Indian ever been president of the American Public Health Association. First of all, APHA needs, and I'm working on it, APHA needs to recognize that there are communities that, given the way that things are the structures that exist, don't really address that issue. Other communities, we all have different we're all confronted by different challenges, but for Native communities, the real issue is representation. How many state representatives, are there any Native representatives here in Utah in the legislature? Anybody? No? Okay, well, that kind of says it all then. No. In New Mexico, we do have some, but interestingly enough, New Mexico likes to think we're sort of there culturally, and the economy is really has always been built on Indian jewelry, Indian tourism. Now it's Indian gaming. There's an upside and downside to that, but we just went through a redistricting in New Mexico, and it's like the two dominant groups obviously are Anglo and Hispanic, and they kind of run the legislature. And when's the last time somebody who had power and privilege said, "Hey, here, take this. I'm tired of it. I don't like power. I don't like privilege. Here, you take it. I don't need it. I don't want it." It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. People get in there and they just, they never give it up. They never want. We talk about sharing, and it's a joke. Nobody wants to share power and privilege. It's like it's all mine. It's like a fiefdom, and they're going to let anybody in there because somebody may see things. The whole redistricting thing, it was played out, the way it played out in New Mexico was fascinating, really disappointing. Both Republicans and Democrats were I'll just say I was disappointed in other people when they saw the way it was being set up and the way it rolled out. Let's see. I think that's, okay. Just one, I think this is the last little note from CDC. And there's some new data that just came out, I think, a week ago about life expectancy. And Indian people in 2019 and 2020, our life expectancy relative to other populations, not that anybody comes out really well with this, but our life expectancy is the shortest, and dropped considerably in 2019 and 2020. So I just want to tell you, I'm really happy to be here with you. And you should be happy that I'm here. Because I'm the one trying to push the numbers up. And justifying, public health and social work's existence, because I'm an example. I'm the poster child for the fact that you're doing good work. Because I'm still here. We still got a lot of work to do. So but I'm making light of a serious issue that our mortality rate is just, it exceeds any other community in this nation, and has from day one. Pre-COVID, who had the highest mortality morbidity rates of any population? We did. Post-COVID, we have the highest. And I think but there's an upside and there's a cultural twist here. Native populations also had the highest vaccination rates, which brings me to a little cultural sort of thing, dynamic, and that is that Native people still have a sense of community, still have a sense of tribe, still have a sense of duty and obligation to the group, to the community. We recognize that our lives and have been are connected, and that we're dependent upon each other's, and have always been. I think it's a cultural traditional value. On the other hand, Those of us who want to be, I mean, it's sort of, there's this, the group, there's the individual. Those of us who want our freedom, nobody can, it's my right to do what I want to do. I can do whatever I want. I don't own anything. I don't owe anything to anybody else but myself. My freedom, my right to choose to be vaccinated or not vaccinated. There's a real dichotomy here, and there's something to be said for freedom. But freedom when you're putting other people, your family members, other community members at risk, at some point there has to be some sort of acknowledgement that the individual does not stand on their own, that we're all part of a community, and that we have duty and obligation to each others in a variety of ways. And to break that relationship, to say that I don't need anybody, I mean, and I don't owe anything to anybody, I think is really, it's hard for me to understand. But Native population, there are other values that really lend themselves and I think have practical, there is such a body called Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous wisdom, and it's finally beginning to be acknowledged in terms of, this is one example, but in terms of the environment and what we're doing with the environment and some of the traditional practices in terms of forest management, some of the traditional practices in terms of land management and there, we didn't survive here. And I'll just say this: there was a recent finding this last year in New Mexico, White Sands, where they found, archaeologists, God bless archaeologists and anthropologists, they found footprints they've established that go back over 21,000 years. Yeah. Those were my footprints. No. They match just exactly. But, so, if we've managed for 21,000 years and we didn't, we're still here, we might know a little bit about surviving. We might know a little bit about about the balance that's essential to life. And one last thing I'll just say, and then let's get, and I'm done. And I need help. The other thing I would say is, Stephen Hawking, British astrophysicist, supposed to be the genius of all time, said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change. We're about ready to find out how intelligent we really are. I'm less concerned about the intelligence. It's important. We're in an academic environment. It's knowledge and intellect, intelligence, credentials. But I'm more concerned, and I think that we need to emphasize and also look at wisdom. And wisdom just does not just exist in an academic environment. Wisdom is universal. Some of the wisest people I know, my elders and other people I've come in contact, some Indian, some non-Indian, they have wisdom. They exhibit it, they live it, they practice it, and it is an important value. It's an important tradition. And these people don't have PhDs, they don't have, some didn't even go to high school, much less anything else. But they know life. They know what's important. And most of them are very humble, and have an element of humanity and humbleness that is refreshing in this day and age. Okay, let's do something fun now. The group the real intelligentsia is up, please.
I love the team effort here for this next part. Is it afternoon? Yes, good afternoon. I think we all have our mics perfect so that our audience that is watching online today can participate, be able to hear us. And First, I want to thank you, Michael, for your insights, for sharing your experience on this very important topic. And as our interim dean, Osteen, mentioned, my name is Dina Ned, and I'm an associate professor lecturer here in the College of Social Work. I'm also a curricular chair for our BSW program, and I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. I'm glad, so happy, to be part of today's event and to help highlight the unique strengths and challenges that are impacting our health care for American Indians, Alaska Natives, and for Native Hawaiians. And I've been looking forward to moderating this discussion with this wonderful group of colleagues, friends, and peers. So in addition to Michael, I am happy to be joined by Donna Eldridge and Jessie Welch-Stockton. And a little bit about Miss Eldridge. She earned both her BSW and her MSW degrees here at the College of Social Work at the University of Utah, and is now the Associate Director for the School of Medicine, Office of Health, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Donna is committed to developing and implementing a culture of inclusion in which students, faculty, and staff experience a genuine sense of belonging, engagement, and achievement. As the Associate Director, Donna is responsible for the development and implementation of content for the Office of Health, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion activities and their programming that contribute to the achievement of diversity and inclusion, which includes the recruitment, the retention, and the success of underrepresented students in health sciences. Thank you for being here, Donna. And as to my left, for Jessie, Jessie is also a recent graduate of the College of Social Work here at the U with both a BSW and MSW degree. Yes. And Jessie is currently working towards her LCSW, her licensed clinical social work, by working here at the University of Utah's healthcare system. Jessie has a passion for public health and social work, sounds a lot like Michael as well, and the intersections of mental health and health disparities. Jessie has experience in both the private and public sectors, with some of her more notable work as an intern for the United States Surgeon General's office in Washington, D.C., and as a research assistant for a grant-funded World Health Organization research project on interventions for aging communities. Jessie continues advocating for American Indian Alaska Native issues related to equitable access to resources and closing the gaps of health disparities in our Native communities. So, before we get started, for those who are attending here live, thank you for being here. We got you out of the foul weather, if anything, and stimulating conversation. So if you have a question for the panel, if you will stand or raise your hand to catch our attention, that would be wonderful. I will repeat the question that you ask so our online folks can hear. And if you are attending online, if you will please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit any questions you have. I already have one that has been submitted, so I think what I would like to do, to give everyone time to think about your questions, is to have, really this is going to be a discussion with the panelists, and I've taken a few notes from the conversation and the points that Michael had made. And I think where I would like to start is thinking about the issues that Michael presented to us that are experienced at disproportionately high rates across Indian country. And Indian country I am designating as the United States. This would also extend to First Nations and Métis. If I want to go north of the border, which we did not create, but that's another conversation, as well as for those south of the United States, also North America, Central America, and South America. So in that context, we experience these legal challenges, the resistance movements that came out of the civil rights eras, what's happening at Standing Rock, what's happening with our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. These are all outcomes, if you will, of centuries of this population surviving, right? And that this act of colonization or settler colonialism did exactly what it was intended to do, which was remove from the indigenous populations of this continent language, spirituality, land, and when those didn't annihilate or assimilate the people, removing their children and dismantling the family, right? These are issues and concerns, again, for centuries. So the question I have for our panel, knowing your passion, your commitment to our Native communities, my question to you is, what community issues or concerns did you see or experience that may have contributed to you wanting to seek out a degree in social work or in public health, right? Or to seek out these research and advocacy opportunities for community engagement? Oh, and let me preface, right? And let me preface this with, if at any time there's a question that I'm asking, I'm not going to point directly to any of our panelists because this is, again, a discussion, and I'm just looking forward to your contributions versus making you.
Okay. We all know you have good thoughts.
Yeah.
Sure.
So we won't boo. You're fine.
They're great.
They're great.
So everything that, let me just quickly reintroduce myself. So my name is Donna Eldridge. I'm Diné. I'm Navajo. I'm originally from Sonosti, New Mexico. My father still lives in Sonosti. And some of those health disparities that Dina was naming is still going on today and affecting our communities. My dad currently lives in the same home that we grew up in with no running water, no electricity, no indoor plumbing. And also, in addition to, our family has went through assimilation, colonization, boarding school, and so for me, experiencing all those health disparities, growing up, I wanted to see change, and also lack of resources in schools for students as well. When I went to school, I actually dropped out at 16, and because I didn't have that support system in high school, I didn't have representation of Native folks because I went to high school here in Salt Lake, and I didn't have that support system. So when I went back to school, it was extremely important for me that I see representation in different fields. For example, healthcare, where I currently work right now, seeing Native American health physicians in the field and supporting recruiting and retaining more Native American physicians.
Thank you.
I think for me, as far as kind of like what brought me to social work / wanting to like boost Native voices would probably be just like my own family's experience within like colonization. So like me personally, my dad was pulled from the reservation and put into the foster care system and adopted to a white family. And through that, we lost our language, we lost our ability to connect with our lineage, to connect with the tribe. And that's still something that he is trying to reconnect the dots to this day. I'm also Native on my mom's side, and it happens similarly on that side as well, but just seeing how my family is unable to connect to resources as far as health resources. Like, those resources aren't available on the reservation, so you have to leave the reservation. So I think it's just a matter of, like, do we die on the reservation, or do you leave the reservation and continue to live on via resources? So I think that was something that was always important to me, is just bring those resources back onto the reservations and back to our land, so that we can continue to, like, care for our land and continue on our lineages.
Thank you. So I'm hearing family, I'm hearing community. That's almost as if there's something intrinsic in the work that we do as Indigenous peoples, regardless of whether we are living reservation, urban, rural, off-reservation. There's always this pull and this connection back to family and community. Again, one of those efforts of colonialism, colonization, settler colonialism, of how do you dismantle a people? You break apart their families. Yet, when we talked about resilience or this survival mechanism, that's what it's about. And I appreciate, Michael, you saying that about the draw for our communities and our families, because that hasn't gone anywhere. And that land is beyond an economic asset for Indigenous communities. That's the huge difference, right? And that land rights reinforce nationhood. So for those who have heard about the movement for land back, our movement for understanding and bringing home our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, this is about a connection between what is family, what is community. When there's violence against women, there's violence against the land. So I appreciate what you've shared about where your passion stems, which was community. So I think I'd like to, we have questions here in the audience, and I also have some from online. So I think I'm going to turn over to our question here. Since you're on the front row, and it'll be easy for me to hear and repeat.
Right. Thank you. So something I would like to know is, like, especially being a person of color, like in higher education and in situations where typically there isn't a lot of representation, how do you navigate the difference between, like, potential, like, white allies and people that are offensive? And sometimes it feels like appropriation as well. How do you mitigate the damage that comes from those sort of relationships? Does that make sense?
So the question that we have is, when you are a person of color in higher ed, how do you navigate or mitigate damage that can occur from well-meaning allies or white allies that can oftentimes come across as appropriation? I like this question. I'll have something to say about this too. But with that, I'll turn if there's a response from our panel. How do you navigate higher ed as an Indigenous person when we know the histories and navigating that damage? There's a lot of emotional labor. That's what you're talking about.
It requires a lot of energy, personal energy, psychic energy. I think I'm reminded of a story a number of years back. Happened to meet a woman who was a non-Native woman who was working for an organization that was doing work with Native communities. And so I was trying to be helpful, and I said, well, I think she came from Detroit. Father had been an automotive executive, and so she had her own story. But it was the first time she was working with Native communities. And so I said, well, you might want to read this book. So I gave her a book that's one of the best books you could ever want. It's been out, Vine Deloria's book titled Custer Died for Your Sins. And Vine Deloria was incredible. He was an amazing writer. And so I gave it to her at a meeting, and I saw her a couple months later, and I said, well, did you read the book? And she said, no. And I'm going like, well, why not? She said, he's so angry. And I'm going, and so I looked at her and I said, so am I.
Yeah, we all are.
But I said, the point is, you need to ask the next question, and the next question is, why is he angry? If you can't get past that, you've got a problem. And I think that the thing that I've experienced, and I can say this nationally, I mean, with national associations, different organizations, AARP, Berkeley, University of Minnesota, I mean, just a number of settings, is that, you know, you really, I don't take it personally anymore. I mean, because it takes a lot of energy. I mean, it means something to me, otherwise I wouldn't be out there pitching things. But it really falls down to, if somebody says, you know, they want to do something, or they're talking about doing something, or they're saying, well, I'd like to do this, or I'd like to work with the community or help. It's sort of, first of all, first question is, you know, what have you done? What's your track record in terms of working with communities? And if you're willing to do that, what have you done? And show me what you're doing. Don't just talk about, you know, oh, I was thinking about doing this with communities, I was thinking about doing this with whatever community color. But it's really about the track record. And if somebody doesn't have a track record, I mean, I understand that. Because there's a lot of people that don't. But if you approach Native people or any community that's been marginalized, you know, if you're going to do something, then make sure you're going to do it. Because our whole experience has been people putting things out there and then not coming through. Unfulfilled expectations cause grief, and we've already had our share. Unfulfilled expectations cause grief, and we've already had our share. Mm-hmm. It's about putting up, it's about showing up and putting up. And if you're not going to do that, I mean, it makes you look foolish for doing it, because we've seen this before. This is like Act 25, and it doesn't work. You look bad, and we've already seen this, and we don't need this. And so, and don't waste time and energy. You know, find the doors. There are people out there who want to do something. You just need to find the right people, approach the right doors, and then see what happens. But it's you know, we can't take it as personal rejection, because it's really not our problem. It's the system's problem. It's the problem that exists out there.
And I think also what's important is learning our history, learning what's affecting our communities, and not just going with the stereotypes or those images that are about Indigenous folks. It's learning our history, but also going beyond that, incorporating Native curriculum in your colleges, in your schools. That's extremely important. It's going those beyond that.
I just don't even have anything to add to that.
God, we're good.
That was wonderful, yeah.
So I'll take a minute, right? Because this also falls in line with a question we had from online, which is, what are the best ways white allies can support the efforts of Indigenous activists? And I would even say Indigenous communities. So as a person of color, as an Indigenous person in higher education, how to navigate or mitigate the damage is an ongoing process. It's a process that for myself personally began in first grade for me during the November Let's Learn About American Indians in elementary school by carving out a canoe out of a bar of ivory soap. That way it would float. Or to bring in a toilet paper roll so I could create a totem pole, right? Arts and crafts. And I remember at this moment where my earliest memory of knowing that I was Native, that I was Chickasaw, that I was Choctaw, was probably 2 or 3 years of age. And so here I am in first grade, what is that, 6 or 7? raising my hand and going, I'm Indian, but I don't have a canoe and I don't live in a teepee, and just like, what is this? I don't know these tribes. And being told by the students around me, as well as of our teacher, well, you can't be Indian because you live here on the East Coast. And we've never heard of your tribe. Or tribes that, what do you mean you didn't have a canoe or you didn't live in a teepee? And I tell you, from that moment until I came to the University of Utah as an undergraduate, did I ever tell anyone that I was Native. Because my phenotype, I can pass as non-Native, I can pass as Hispanic, Greek, Italian, anything with an olive complexion, right? And that was my survival. So to get into higher ed, I had to connect with, at that time, programs like the Center for Ethnic Student Affairs. I had to find where I would follow other students of color to see where they were going. I wouldn't ask. I would just sort of like, well, they're going in the union. I think where are they going? That's how I found my home. And then in terms of allies, I've been on this campus as a student, as a graduate student, as an administrator, as a faculty person, as, before all of that, a community member who was called upon, probably because they could check a box, of someone in the community to come up to give their voice, right? It took a long time to learn how to trust those who were not of my community, right? Or had my shared history. All of us up here, we have family and went to boarding schools. All of us up here had family who died from smallpox-infected blankets. I mean, this goes so far back. But in an institution and a system, Michael said it, when we're not at the table, we're what's on the menu. And an institution or a system like higher ed needs to be aware of that and make efforts to place, proportional to our population, people to reflect that population in committees, in administration, in all aspects, the curriculum, right? But it's that finding people that you trust and and then they usually welcome you and introduce you to the people that they trust. And that's how we've kind of created this safety net, if you will. That was my 2 cents on that one.
Dina, I come highly rejected, and I'm proud of it. I've been rejected by some of the finest institutions, by certain organizations. You know what? It's like, okay, what else? What else is new? Tell me something new, I mean, it's like I put that on my resume, comes highly rejected by the following entities.
They're like, we want you. Maybe you talk, great question, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to follow now with a question from online, which is, social work emphasizes the need for evidence-based and best practices. Can someone on our panel tell us more about Indigenous people's use of quote-unquote wise practices? And where do we go to learn more about wise practices? I don't know if there's a direct answer for that. Wise practices would be, it's community-based practice. It's informed by community, with community, by the community.
There's a book by Nicole Redvers on Indigenous wisdom. She's Canadian First Nations, and she put out a book about 2 or 3 years ago, Nicole Redvers, and I have a book. She sent me a copy of her book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but there is this growing. I mean, how long? What year is it again? How long has it taken us to like sort of recognize that again, Indigenous people survived on this continent for thousands of years. obviously knows something in terms of the natural environment, in terms of farming. I mean, farming and traditional practices. I mean, and then not, to even go so far as to traditional medicine, traditional practice that are still part of the culture and the traditions of Native people that benefit the people and that in fact do have efficacy for Native populations. So there's this whole body of knowledge, but it's sort of like, well, what do Native people know? What do Indians know? And so it's been disparaged, but it really is coming back. I mean, and God knows, even people, we're so popular now. There's even Native cuisine. I mean, that James Beard winner in Minneapolis, the restaurant Owani. I mean, this guy, he's from, I think he's Lakota or that part of the Plains area originally.
Sioux chef.
Yeah. I mean, we should, he's a James Beard winner. I mean, that's, and he got all these people coming and wanting to, I don't know if he's got fried bread or not, but, whatever he's doing, I mean, and it is based on traditional sort of recipes and food. And, finally, people are, there's a whole lot of things that we've known and are good at, and people are finally sort of like, oh, well, maybe Indians got something going on there that we need to be paying attention to.
And I think, too, the language of the question, as an academic, I understand. But I think there's a need to change the vernacular, the words that we're using, and to understand that indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous methodologies are just as effective, efficient, and based in scientific study as Western methods, right? So instead of saying something like evidence-based or best practices, maybe we need to change that to practice-based evidence, because there are over 570 federally recognized American Indian tribes. That means there are over 570 ways in which to understand the universe and relationships and how to raise families and communication and spirituality and what foods to eat when we can't make it up to see the sous chef, right?
Can't afford it probably anyway. I'm speaking for myself anyway.
Exactly. And so in higher ed, that goes back to the question as well, is the importance of understanding the diversity in the way we understand our world.
Tina, there is a book, see, if you've been around a while and your mind's still kind of halfway functional, there is a book that was published back in the 60s or early 70s by Dr. Karl Hammerschlag. It's titled The Dancing Healers. And Karl Hammerschlag is a psychiatrist that worked in the Indian Health Service in New Mexico, and he actually worked at the Santa Fe Indian Hospital. He was there before I was. But he talks about what he learned and from the native healers in the area, and it's really less about it's really about his journey into a whole new way of conceptualizing mental health and therapy and practice, and drawing on knowledge that was shared with him. And it really does validate the role of traditional medicine and traditional practice in terms of psychotherapy and therapy. And so, if any of you are interested, Karl Hammerschlag, The Dancing Healers.
Right. Thank you for that. I saw some hands up here in the audience. We'll go here first.
My name is Tony Michelle Hanazba, and I am Navajo or Dene, born for a Bilagana or a settler. And he doesn't get it when I say that, even if I say colonizer. He's like, White privilege. And my mother's clans are Bitterwater or Twitachini, born for salt. So I actually have a question for Jessie or Ms. Stockton Welch. So you talked about like accessibility and this disconnect that you had on both sides of your family. And I wonder about even, like Dina said, she's recognized within the Choctaw Nation or a citizen, but she also has Chickasaw. And we know because of how blood quantums were established that they, like, who we can identify as is definitely not us. They say it's us. It's not us that gets to decide that. You're talking about accessibility. I'm wondering about some of the challenges you and your family came across as you were trying to navigate that, and then how you were resilient, like how you figured out the workarounds for accessing.
So I would say one side of my family was really successful, and that was because of a really good lawyer. And I think that one of the issues with the way that child welfare was prior to ICWA was that when children were removed from homes and adopted out to white families, those records are federally sealed. And part of proving lineage or blood quantum is being able to provide, how your lineage traces back. So my dad has never been able to trace his back. The tribe has been rather receptive to him, based on his circumstances. But he, I don't know if that will ever be a possibility for him. On my mom's side, my grandpa was able to prove our lineage despite adoption records. So we've kind of been able to I guess we never left the tribe, but I guess we've re-assimilated ourselves, I guess, into the tribe. I don't really know what the word would be, anti-assimilate ourselves from the normal population. But so I think that that's just been a collaborative effort of my family to get reconnected to our community. But I think that those resources are just not readily available. And so kind of also going back to what you said about how 40% of Natives don't even know that they're Native. It's hard to know that you're Native if you've been removed. And I think that they did that on purpose to make sure that we didn't continue on. And a lot of it has to do with land. But I think for me and my family, reconnecting has been really an important aspect of how I grew up, and just recognizing all of the disparities that happen on Native lands. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does.
Okay, cool.
Well, I was looking at, thank you for that.
Dina,
I'm looking at the clock.
lady.
I know we go until 1:30. There's still more questions here, and we've had online. And I also haven't had an opportunity to ask the panel if there was anything else you would like to share that maybe you were prepared for that I didn't capture, or the questions here. So I'm just going to look for a sign. If I can take one more question here.
Are we on Indigenous time or white man time?
I like to straddle both those sides.
You
Yeah.
have to.
So I'll take one more question. Yes, please. Here in the audience.
I'm a social work student, and I'm really interested in psychedelic assisted therapy. And you kind of touched on healing and medicine. My question is, how would it look for non-Indigenous people to engage in plant medicine with Indigenous roots in non-appropriating ways?
So the question here comes from a student here on what to do therapy and work with plant medicines
Or cultural medicine.
or cultural medicines so that it is respectful versus appropriated, right? That's a good question. Any opinions of plant medicine?
I guess I just would say, I'm sure that there are, there's a lot of, there is a big renaissance now in terms of more attention, thank God, to Native issues and Native topics. And I think that I would imagine that there are some Native folks that are doing some work in that area. The question is finding them, identifying them, and then, you know, seeing if they're open to a conversation and open to engagement in some form or fashion. And you know, they might be, and then again they might not be, for a variety of reasons, you know, on terms of their community. I mean, because people have appropriated things, you know. I mean, it goes on, it happens, you know. There are people that take something and repackage it and say, look what I discovered, you know, when in fact, you know, it's been, you know, stolen, taken, and misrepresented or misused. So there is that very, very real issue and barrier, I think, to engagement.
And understanding many medicine is done with ceremony. And that ceremony is not purchased, is not sold, and is done based on community teachings, right? So plant medicine also is very much set in the location in which you are living. So I think it's an investment, much along the lines of what Michael was saying in terms of communication, but that investment in getting to know a community without the intent of answering the question, but to become known by that community and do other things. Because too often Native folks are approached because, well, we're cool. There's a lot of knowledge there, but it's also about relationships. And relationships do not happen just because someone is of a good heart or a good mind and like, hey, I want to get to know you and this is why.
But I can be bought.
Yeah. If the price is right.
That's a joke, obviously.
Yeah. It was a great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
And with that, since we have, you know, it's a Wednesday, it's 1:35, I just want to really offer my sincere gratitude. Yukoki, thank you for being involved in this event, for sharing your time, your wisdom, your experiences, and for the impactful service that you give to your families and to your communities. Thank you.
Dina?
Yes, sir.
Can I say one last thing?
Yes, of course.
One of the things that I think is important to say, and I did get a chance to mention it, was that in this country today, and I know there's conversations going on here at the U around the Holocaust and what happened in Europe, and what I find interesting, what I see, is that this nation is open to having that kind of conversation about the Holocaust and what happened to Jews and Gypsies and a whole host of other people. And when it comes to the genocide and the Holocaust that happened here, people are less willing to have that conversation. And I think fundamentally it boils down to, well, that happened over there, it was with those people, and we didn't have anything to do with it. When it comes to this land and Indigenous people, it's much harder for people to have a conversation about that, because it's here, and people are less open to that information and having that kind of a conversation, because they have a variety of feelings about that.
It's still happening and they benefit.
Yeah, guilt. Yeah, the guilt, but there's guilt involved in it. There's how you know, well, if that, you know, if I acknowledge that, then maybe I have to feel some responsibility to do something, you know, to address that. And it's always easy to point at somebody else and say, well, they were terrible, look what they did. But then when you look in the mirror and you say, oh, wait a minute, what happened here? And in this country, there's a bit of historical amnesia. And there's a reason it exists, because it's oftentimes too close and too hard to acknowledge and address. But until that kind of, it's like therapy. I mean, it's like therapy, and and until you put it on the table, and you have the conversation, and you own it, and you recognize it, and you take it in, and you only then can you really move on. And God knows, I know a lot of people avoid therapy, including myself, for a long time. So I know how hard that is. But you can only move on if you deal with it, if you put it on the table, if you acknowledge it and own it and work through it. So I would hope that the conversations about what happened in Europe would also be open to having broader acknowledgement and recognition of the fact that it's played out here. It continues to play out many other places. And we're not going to really be able to move ahead until we look at what is going on for all people. Because it's about all of us. It's not just about one community or one population.
Can I just ask a quick question based on that, if you mind? For the Western world, do you think it's because they had that savior complex thing where they're like, oh, we saved everybody over there in genocide. We're not going to admit that we actually did it in our own country because we didn't save those people.
Yeah.
So do you think that's a part of it?
I think it's probably part of it, yeah. But I can see that playing out.
The question was, for clarification, if what Michael just shared, does that have anything to do with this concept of white savior? And that the United States was unable to save anyone.
They admit that they actually did it without
They were
saving-
perpetrators
Yeah.
and benefited from,
Right.
yeah.
Which would be, I hope, another part of our speaker series here at the College of Social Work. To go even deeper into this subject matter. So thank you for, I think that your closing remarks just now, I think, really captured what was said here today, and to get us thinking about what happens next. I want to thank everyone here in the college for joining us today. Thank everyone who stayed with us online. It is much appreciated. And to all of those who are watching this recording somewhere in the future, thanks for doing that as well. And I had mentioned the College of Social Work is dedicated to this speaker series as part of our effort to address the grand challenges for social work, which are truly grand challenges for all of our communities. And we welcome you to join us throughout the academic year as we delve more into many more practice-based and evidence-based research presentations addressing these major challenges that our society is facing today. And so to learn more about that, check out our college events page for more information on all of our events. And with that, I will say good afternoon to all of you. And again, thank you for joining us.